Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV Historical Edition. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Douglas Brunt has the useful gift of writing histories that read like novels, as he previously demonstrated with his part mystery story, part biography of Rudolf Diesel. The National Review recently recognized, in the course of reviewing the lost empire of Emmanuel Nobel, Romanovs, revolutionaries, and the forgotten titan who fueled the world. While the aforementioned The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, Genius, Power, and Deception on the Eve of World War I, the Wall Street Journal complimented as a well-researched and well-written biography. Even before then, the Washington Post had already praised Brunt as making a name for himself in fiction over The Ghost of Manhattan, which inspired Forbes to spotlight him as a persuasive storyteller, The Means, and The Trophy Son. And he joins us today to talk about it all. Doug, welcome to the show. So growing up discovering the worlds of storytelling, could we have found you exploring the high seas and historical adventures as much as solving mysteries, say, with the Hardy Boys?
I was a big reader. I grew up, I think Frog and Toad, those were just coming out. And from there it was Hardy Boys. And from there it was Tolkien. And then, kind of a mix of Ludlum, Hemingway, John Irving, a little bit here and there. Always reading ever since I was a little guy. The history stuff came a little later. One of the things I try to do is write history in a novelistic way. It's narrative history. So you catch it, this sort of big canvas backdrop of huge historical events, but through the life of an individual. And I remember I had one teacher in high school who was just amazing. He had actually fought in World War II and he did some espionage work. And so he actually had all these Nazi artifacts that he would bring into class. And that was the first time I was really into history in a big way, but always a big reader, mostly fiction as a little kid.
Any favorite history teachers or professors who inspired you, whether, say, a high school English teacher or a writing professor once you were studying at Harvard?
I'm almost 55 now. And so most of my high school hero teachers have passed on. But the history teacher I mentioned was Brownlow. He was just terrific. And my English teacher that I adored was Barry Berg. He was awesome. I was very lucky to have a great English department where I went to school. So
successful prose fiction weaves together the fabric of true life experience with the artificial fiber of created characters and synthesized plot lines. The final quilt is seamless. You can't tell which are the real fibers and which are the synthetic ones. This quilt is stronger and more form-fitting than the literal truth. It provides us with a lesson, a moral, or a path toward our own future. Forbes offers, before acknowledging, that reading The Ghost of Manhattan, it's easy to understand how the worst of Wall Street came apart, especially when we see it through the point of view of our protagonist here, Nick Farmer. Isn't just another soulless sellout. He has heart and, it turns out, courage. So we follow him through a Celine-esque world of hallucinatory Wall Street decadence and depravity as we find ourselves rooting for his final chance at escape. What was swirling around your imagination as you wrote Ghost of Manhattan through his point of view as Farmer struggles to regain his moral compass before it's too late?
It's not based on any person, just as you say, an amalgamation. So you're talking about the novel Ghosts of Manhattan. Nick Farmer's a bond salesman for Bear Stearns, which of course now is defunct. And I'm actually just sort of realizing this now, but it's another way of the big backdrop, sort of broad canvas of history told through a story, through an individual. So it's set in a sort of 06, 7, 8 period of the mortgage-backed credit default swap crisis that just brought us all down, and all these banks need to be rescued. But he's a bond salesman who kind of sees some of this going on. It's largely about a marriage, but and all the crazy nightlife that happens with the entertainment side of the business of, in particular, sales and trading on Wall Street. And it's all going down as the market's just completely collapsing. But before that collapse, the entertainment side of the business was wild. And bonuses were wild. And, I think I've seen Elon Musk say some things like this, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. If you're compensating someone on volume, they're going to give you volume. Like, they were just putting these credit default swaps through as many as they could without really taking a peek under the hood at whether these instruments were sound and healthy. And they weren't. They were giving mortgage loans to anyone, 0%, so. The waiter from down the street was taking out a big mortgage to buy some giant house they, of course, couldn't afford. And at some point, the interest does kick in and you have to start paying, and all of a sudden they default on the loan. So all these loans started defaulting. All the stuff that had been repackaged and resold just collapsed. And that was at the heart of it. So but the novel Ghost of Manhattan is about that backdrop, but also the sort of life of a Wall Street bond salesman. In that sense, it was almost like historical fiction, even though it's going back only like a couple years. I think I probably wrote a lot of it in 2010, and I was talking about 2008. But the big struggles he had were not only what was happening professionally and with the work he was doing, and as you say, these sort of rotten core of the products that were at the heart of what he's selling and trading, but also his marriage. I mean, the whole atmosphere of his work on Wall Street was, he had big decisions to make about how he's going to, I guess save his soul. Not to sound dramatic, but he had a couple big decisions to make.
Part Primary Colors, part House of Cards. The Means takes you deep into high-stakes politics, where everyone has something to hide. Book Reporter advertises amid introducing us to Tom Pauley, a conservative trial attorney in Durham, North Carolina, who's tapped by GOP leaders to campaign for the governor's mansion. His bold style makes him a favorite for a run at the White House, while the current POTUS, Mitchell Mason, is the president-elect of the United States, pushed into politics by a father determined to create a political dynasty. Mason manages the White House with a personal touch that makes both friends and enemies. What fascinated you about playing these characters off of journalist Samantha Davis as she doggedly pursues a decades-old story that could trigger a scandal that would upend a political landscape, with prose that creates an incisive portrait of ambition, power, and what it takes to win in the ruthless world of politics today and the means?
What I was exploring with the means, and that comes from the ends justify the means, was the intersection of politics and media. And it's very fraught. The media needs access, so they've got to be, they've got to court them a little bit, but then they need to hold them to account and then say, you're too tough. And then all of a sudden the president says, I'm not even going to meet with you again. You get no more interviews. And so there's this dance that they play, and it's not an easy one. So Samantha Davis is the reporter. Tom Pauley's a presidential candidate, and the whole book is really following a presidential campaign. And it's really the only book that I have told from multiple perspectives. I think it was important to do it in that case, to give the different perspectives from politics and media as this whole thing plays out. But that was a fun book to do research. I talked to presidential campaign managers like Bob Beckel, who ran, I think, Mondale. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the guy who ran Reagan, but he was a terrific guy too. I had a few meetings with him, and a number of different political operatives and some congressmen and stuff who gave me a lot of insider DC stories. And man, it's like the underbelly of DC is like nothing else. It's crazy. So that's a fun book.
Now, there's a moment in your novel, The Trophy Son, where a friend reminds the main character, Anton Stratus, that the bigger the star, the bigger the sacrifice. It's a theme that runs throughout the book, which follows a tennis prodigy, Anton, as he deals with an obsessive and overbearing father, navigates the competitive world of professional sports and the performance-enhancing drugs that inevitably come with it, and struggles to figure out who he is outside the court, and what Town and Country magazine congratulated as at once a fascinating look inside this milieu, and also a cautionary tale about the dangers of our achievement-obsessed society. Now, is it true you were basing Trophy Son in part off your own experience playing professional tennis back in high school?
I ended up picking tennis later on. The initial, it was actually chess was the first thing that got me going on this. But at that time, had young kids in New York City. The initial title was Specialized. And the premise of the book is to explore our cultural obsession with early single sport specialization. And I remember I was talking to some other parents, like kindergarten age kids, and they're going to spend all weekend at some chess tournament. Some high school cafeteria gets converted over to host a chess tournament, like 8 hours on a Saturday, and round 2 is 8 hours on a Sunday. And if you want to be good at this, if you want your kid to be good at this, you're playing chess 24/7 pretty much as a kindergartner. It's just wild. And, none of these kids is going to go on to do chess, as a lifetime thing. And I'm sure it's good as a mental whatever to become good at chess. That seems like, exercise for your brain. I'm sure that's all good. And then the more I looked into it, the more things had changed since, you and I were in high school in the 80s or so. And it's not how it was then. Back then you played a bunch of sports and you tried different things and you had tons of free time to be bored and do other things. And now it's like you sort of lock in on one sport by the time you're 10, 11, in the suburbs, it's a lot of lacrosse or soccer. And then as I interviewed a lot of athletes, I I recognize that tennis is about the most extreme. And, even if you're a great lacrosse player or soccer player, you still finish high school, play for your team. With tennis, oftentimes, if you're good, and sometimes not even like clearly on the path for pro, but just good enough, you homeschool, you leave school in eighth grade or so, ninth grade, and you go to a Bollettieri academy, of which there are many examples. There are many kinds of Bolletteris now, and you basically train for tennis all day long, do a few hours of coursework and stuff like that. So tennis is really at the extreme end of some of this, and so I picked tennis as my way in for the novel, and it follows a tennis prodigy. And by the way, tons of these kids leave mainstream schooling, they go to an academy, and then they like barely play college, or maybe they play a little bit of college tennis, and that's it. I mean, it's a crazy sacrifice of your youth to make for a sport that is almost certainly not going to be a big part of your adult life. It kind of explores our cultural shift that happened, in a small amount of my lifetime. It wasn't like that when I was in high school, and it's definitely that way now. One of the common themes among most of those young women, so Monica Seles, Capriati, Mary Pierce, there are a number who were Martina Hingis. They were all on the tour. Women develop a little faster than men physically. So there were 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds on the tour. One of the things that was common among them was they all had a maniacal parent, usually the dad. But it was just like they were driven by some parent putting them out there.
A famous inventor vanishes at sea under the cover of darkness. His disappearance benefits powerful men in a world on the brink of war, inspiring speculation about suicide, mishap, murder, or a fake death. How would you look for the truth? Douglas Brunt's written a post-mortem on the life of the German inventor who designed an engine a century ago that powers millions of vehicles around the globe. Diesel's creation transformed the world, achieving far greater efficiency than any internal or external combustion engine in his day. His disappearance while crossing the Channel from Belgium to England in September 1913 launched a tidal wave of rumors that left unanswered questions in its wake. And it becomes clear early on the author plans to solve Diesel's 1913 disappearance conclusively, arguing that he didn't fall overboard or take his own life, but secretly defected with the help of the British government and designed submarine engines during World War I. What intrigued you about this enduring question to set out to solve it here definitively? And the pages of the mysterious case of Rudolf Diesel, genius, power, and deception on the eve of World War I.
Yeah, with Diesel, my way into it was the disappearance and this crazy mystery of what actually happened to him. So that was my first entry into the Diesel story. And then I kind of went back and told the story of, from his youth up until his invention, and then why the invention mattered, and then why the invention could matter so much that he might be the subject of a murder plot by a number of people. Or other reasons. The diesel engine has been our main power source around the world for more than 100 years. And in telling that story, all of a sudden you form your suspects. Like, oh my gosh, this engine does all these things, and this guy lived this crazy life. It's when Rudolf Diesel first brought the engine to public attention in 1897. He licensed it out by national territory. You would license the exclusive rights to manufacture and market the engine by national territory, and the person who had the license for Russia was Emmanuel Nobel. So he became one of the world's leading diesel engine manufacturers through his facilities in St. Petersburg, and advanced the engine. He did the first reversing diesel engine for marine use. And then those two became friends, and just reading everything I could find, memoirs, and making a lot of the early research on diesel happened during COVID. And so I was trying to make friendships digitally with people in archives in Germany. So I found out where the main archives were that had most of the diesel materials, had them send information over, and then just started reading to get a full picture of the story. And one of the ironic things that I learned, I'd found he actually did keep a little bit more diary journal material than Nobel had. That was interesting. Of his trips to America, he kept detailed notes in this notebook that was so fascinating to go through. But in 1883, this is a full 14 years before he introduces the engine publicly, he had the idea of the engine, and he wrote a list of intended uses for the diesel engine, which was basically for rural craftsman shops like jewelries and bookbinders and dentistry and things like that. His whole point, as you mentioned, he grew up poor. He was born in Paris, And then with the Franco-Prussian War, anyone of Germanic descent was evicted basically from France. So in 1870, they're on the run from Paris. They go to London, where they live in tenement housing. It's literally the area of London that's the setting for Oliver Twist, with the Artful Dodger and all that. So I mean, they're really impoverished. But he's a brilliant guy, and people recognize that. And so an uncle sort of rescues him and puts him up so he can get an education back in Germany. So he's basically sponsored by his uncle to go to study math. But because of that, at the age of 12 or so, but because of those very rough first 12 years where he's living in London and he's seeing really the underbelly of the Industrial Revolution, he has this idea where, on the one hand, in London at that time, he's seen only these enormous steam engines with the furnace. When I describe it, I tell people to think about the scene in the movie Titanic, where they're shoveling coal into this enormous orange fiery furnace. It's burning all the coal that heats a huge vat of water to turn that to steam that turns the gears of the engine. There's a whole chimney apparatus that takes all the soot from the burning coal in the furnace out the chimney stack. I mean, these steam engines are just massive. And how could some rural craftsman out in the suburbs or some countryside, have a steam engine that's the size of a house? It's just not practical. So he had this idea, I'm going to build a small, compact engine that will be a power source for decentralized economies rather than these centralized economies. Everyone's moving into the city to the big factories where the steam engines are. He's like, I want to build a compact, simple, smaller power source for decentralized economies. So that was the aim. And one of the great ironies is diesel power became the engine of big industry, and it is to this day. It was certainly smaller, more compact than the huge steam engine, but it was the high torque, big, heavy engine, as opposed to the smaller combustion gas, carburetor type engines. And then obviously the Tesla electric motor became more of something for, a small decentralized power source. But diesel, as much as he set out to do this one thing, it really became the engine of big business. And he saw that all play out in his lifetime. So that was one of the sort of weird ironies for him. The whole diesel story culminates in this crazy disappearance right on the eve of World War I, September 29, 1913. He leaves on an overnight passenger ferry from Belgium heading for Great Britain. And in the night, he disappears. All they find is his coat neatly folded and his hat by the rail of the ship, at the stern of the ship, and no sign of him on board. And it was a calm night. It's not like he got washed over. There was no wind, no waves. But the coat and hat seemed to mark where he may have jumped off. So they're wondering if it was a suicide. So at that point, obviously, there are no more diaries. You're sort of pulling back a little bit to reported history. There was lots of newspaper coverage. He was a huge celebrity at the time. Again, it's one of these covered up things where we don't really know the name today, but when he disappeared, he was one of the main global inventor celebrities. So it was headlines in Russia, New York, all throughout Europe. Everyone was talking about the diesel mystery. It stayed on the front page for weeks. And so the source material there was a lot of newspaper clippings, and then some other materials of people involved in the investigation, or people that he knew that had left some writings behind about it. And then it was also looking at where things played out around the world relative to diesel technology in the early stages of the war. Very strange, not to spoil, but very strange things start happening in Canada and with British engine manufacturing companies. And, obviously the Germans were highly motivated to keep diesel expertise inside Germany. Rudolph's initial aim was that there would almost be a central knowledge base where all these diesel licensees around the world, from Russia and South America, and in America, the person who had the license was Adolphus Busch, founder of Budweiser beer. And he was building diesels for his breweries, but also for the U.S. Navy submarine program. But diesel hoped initially that people would share information as they made advances with diesel technology. We would be collective about it, and we'd all benefit from it. As soon as the application to war was clear, You cannot run a submarine without diesel. Gasoline, kerosene engines didn't work; had to be diesel. So and now the submarine in the few years before World War I emerges as this major new weapon, and of course that played out in both World Wars. All the information sharing about diesel technology, it just shut down. Every nation became proprietary, and it was military secrets. If you made an advance with diesel technology. So that kind of went on lockdown, and Rudolf Diesel's, he was still the man. He was still the father of the engine, and suddenly his expertise with the engine became much more valuable as a matter of national security. So that sort of heightens the whole mystery craziness about how he disappeared so strangely.
Striking not just in the ease of reading this compelling history, but also in how vividly and seamlessly the story relates to the swift shifts of leadership, political tumult, and trauma that Emmanuel Nobel endured during the Bolshevik Revolution that took over Russia. Town Hall offers of a captivating read, where Brunt's work unfolds for us an epic incorporating the political reforms and failures of the Romanov family, from Tsar Alexander II, who freed the Russian serfs from feudal tutelage and welcomed foreign investment, thus setting the stage for the Nobel family's enlargement in Russia, to the mistakes of the final Tsar of Russia, and throughout Emmanuel Nobel's working the immense lucrative oil fields of Baku, connecting machine development and combustion engine manufacturing, as he'd employ his latent ingenuity and business acumen to rival and then overtake the largest oil producer in the United States, Standard Oil, under the Rockefellers. Please acquaint those who haven't met Emmanuel Nobel, Romanovs, revolutionaries, and the forgotten titan who fueled the world.
The crux of the book takes place in the quarter century leading up to World War I, that turn of the century, like the early Downton Abbey years, to sort of set the atmosphere. And Emmanuel Nobel was the largest industrialist in the entire Russian Empire. He had two major businesses. One was a machine and munitions factory in northern Russia by St. Petersburg, where he built bombs and rifles and engines. He was one of the largest diesel engine manufacturers in the world for the Tsar's army and navy. And in the south of Russia, he ran the world's largest oil concern along the Caspian Sea in the Caucasus. And the business had been founded by his father and uncle. But in 1888, his father passed away. So from 1888, he took it over when it was big. But by 1900, he had grown it to be larger than Standard Oil. And by the time World War I broke out in 1914, he controlled more oil than anyone else in the world. More than half of Russian oil Emmanuel Nobel controlled. So it was the most important oil concern. Just as our first mechanized war, World War I, breaks out. The roots of the Nobel family are back in Sweden. His grandfather emigrated from Sweden to the Russian Empire in the 1830s. He was also sort of an inventor and experimented with explosives. He built these undersea mines that the Tsar used in the Crimean War. He had three sons, one of which was Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite and who founded the Nobel Prizes. He moved back to Sweden, and that was Emmanuel, our guy here in the story, our main guy. That's Alfred is his uncle. And there's this crazy story connecting the two of them. When Emmanuel's father passed away, his name was Ludwig. He passed away in 1888, as I mentioned. He was a very famous guy. Emmanuel's history has really been erased, and we'll I suppose, get into some of that in a bit. But his father was a famous guy when he passed away, so his headlines in newspapers all around the world. Alfred Nobel is off in France running his dynamite business. He picks up the newspaper, alive and well, and reads his own obituary. The French newspapers got it wrong. They thought Alfred died when it was really Ludwig in Russia. And so the newspapers go on to say Alfred Nobel is this merchant of death, and because of his invention of dynamite that's caused more death and destruction than in the history of humankind, he's this terrible guy. And so he's like, oh my gosh, this is not how I want to be remembered. So he changes his will to establish the Nobel Prizes. He's going to give all his money away to establish the Nobel Prize. Then he does pass away 8 years later in 1896. And Emmanuel Nobel is the custodian of the will. And when Alfred dies, he has 33 million kroner. He sends 31 to establish the prize, and then just 2 to all his relatives. Well, his relatives are thinking, well, this is like barely anything. We thought we were getting way more than this. So they fight the will. The King of Sweden fights the will, saying Alfred was unduly influenced by the pacifists. That we don't need to establish these prizes. The pacifism movement is too much. So he calls Emmanuel in and says, look, you got to do the right thing by your family. Just don't do this prize thing. But Emmanuel in Russia, the language translation is not really custodian of the will. It's custodian of the soul, which is something he took seriously. So he stood by the prize. He did establish the prizes, and told the king to forget it, and told the family. They got them all together and said, look, we got to do this prize. This is what Alfred wanted. And so the Nobel Prizes would not exist if it were not for Emmanuel. He was the patriarch of the family. And as you get into the story, you realize Emmanuel Nobel was far more successful than Alfred. He did way more. I mean, he was the dominant industrialist really in the world right up until the Russian Revolution and the advent of Bolshevism and communism. He didn't really have a memoir. So it was all letters, mainly to his father and to his uncle, Alfred. Those are the two main sources of correspondence, both ways. He didn't really have like a diary or memoir. So it was all sort of personal correspondence. And thank God it's like the golden age of letter writing. These days, I don't know how we're going to do it 50 years from now when somebody looks back on this decade and, everything's like a forward text message that goes into the ether when we're done. There's no documented correspondence, really just reading volumes. There was no audio of Emmanuel. I've never heard his voice. It's just reading everything you can get your hands on. Tons of photos, of course. There are a lot of photos, both of him up in St. Petersburg and also down in Baku. He was also a business partner and good friend of Rudolf Diesel. So there's correspondence between the two of them. They maintained a good friendship up until Diesel left. Diesel actually traveled to St. Petersburg, so there's lots of information about those visits. Nobel was in Germany visiting Diesel there. So it's just reading reams and reams and reams of material. And from other people's memoirs, they describe him, his character, not only, his physical appearance, but also his character and his leadership qualities, how he was, under duress from, the point of Lenin and Stalin coming after him, basically.
Oil fields in Baku around Azerbaijan became even more productive than those of Pennsylvania 20 years earlier. And when Ludwig Nobel died in 1988, his son Emmanuel expanded the business and soon competed with John D. Rockefeller to dominate the world's oil market. Kirkus Reviews shares, where at this point Brunt introduces a familiar character, an occasional employee of the Nobels, who later called himself Stalin. A nasty figure, he devoted himself to agitation among oil workers and leading criminal gangs that extorted money and robbed banks to support revolutionaries, while Emmanuel Nobel soldiered on. We'd love if you'd shed some light here on how the rise of one of the founding leaders of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, first took shape, and why he had Nobel in the sights of his scopes as he took power.
It's such a clear line between Nobel and Stalin. Nobel's whole oil operation is down in southern Russia, modern-day Azerbaijan, but at the time was part of the Russian Empire along the Caspian Sea. That's where all the oil is in this ancient city of Baku. And nearby in the country of Georgia, that's where Stalin is born. Many people from Georgia work in the oil fields, either doing transportation or in the drilling or the refining operations in the Caucasus. And Stalin grew up there on these hard scrabble streets. As you say, it's not a justification, but you can see the kind of path he was on from early days. I mean, he's getting beat up in the streets most mornings, kind of a little guy with a deformed arm. His mother was off and on again a prostitute. His father was an abusive alcoholic. He then goes to the seminary. He's training to be a priest, of all things. If you can imagine, Stalin was on his way to being a priest. And at that time, the Russian Empire under the Tsars was expanding toward the Black Sea, and they're trying to get warm water ports, as they are today, right? They want the Crimean Peninsula for warm water ports and the Black Sea out to the Mediterranean. Same thing under the Tsars. They all wanted to conquer that land. They annexed the country of Georgia. So Stalin, who is Georgian, grows up as this sort of, in this colonialized territory of the Russian Empire, resenting Russia. And he is a Georgian who speaks the native language, but all of a sudden Russia passes a law. You may not speak Georgian in the schools. You have to speak Russian, something he resents. So he takes on this kind of subversive persona from a very young age. He does come across Marxist doctrine, and he starts meeting Marxist subversive groups in out-of-the-way places and cemeteries in the middle of the night. He starts writing for Marxist newspapers. Eventually, he becomes Lenin's sort of main guy in southern Russia, down in the Caucasus region, and becomes sort of like a gangster and is robbing bank payroll and trying to send money up to Lenin to support the Bolsheviks. He does even work in the oil fields. So the two main oil operations down there are the Nobel family, and they're by far the largest, but the next largest is the Rothschild family. Nobel has worked at one time or another for both, and he's agitating worker unrest and starting strikes and, causing all kind of havoc down there. But right in his sights, the main, not only is he sort of opposed to capitalism due to his Marxist principles, but the main capitalists that he sees day in, day out in his youth in southern Russia are the Nobels. And eventually it leads, to this wild collision at the end of World War I, as Russia pulls out and we move into the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War. It was a weird time there because Stalin and Lenin, they also needed him. The oil was critical, so they wanted to take over Baku and take over the oil, but they also needed the expertise. They needed Nobel and his executives and employees to keep the oil flowing. They couldn't just take it over and not have the people with the know-how. So everyone was sort of courting each other a little bit. And Nobel was able to sort of play that to some extent. What the communists did to Emmanuel Nobel in the period of the Russian Civil War was the inspiration for George Orwell's 1984. They change the street names, they tear down the statues, they rewrite the history. The whole company, Nobel's oil company, was called the Nobel Brothers Petroleum Company. After the Russian Civil War, they nationalized all these businesses, and it's called the Soviet Petroleum Company. His machine factory in the north became Ruski Diesel. So they tore down all the Nobel plaques. They erase Emmanuel Nobel. He becomes a political unperson, and the history of this person is completely lost to the West. And within a generation, lost even within Russia. There's a lot of archival information in Azerbaijan and also in Stockholm that had letters and documents about that period of time. One thing that was interesting that I will say is that he was an enlightened employer. He built, as opposed to most of the oil concerns in there that were brutal places to work. Not only was it very deadly to work out in the oil fields and in the refining operations, but the housing in Baku was, dirt floors and, really, really brutal living and working conditions. Except that Emmanuel Nobel was, he did a lot more for his employees. He built worker housing, he built schools, he built hospitals for employees. He built facilities for leisure activities. And so the employees came to call themselves Nobelites. It was the place you wanted to work. It was the one everyone was hoping to get to, the Nobel place. And so he was thought of as this very benevolent employer. And so when it came time to run, and the communists are out there like, kill the capitalist pigs, take them, string them up, we'll give them some sham kangaroo court, and then we'll kill them. His employer's like, no, this is like one of the good guys. He was actually a good employer. He's not some person that we're all angry at. And that happened for decades in the various mini revolutions or abortive revolutions that happened, like the 1905 revolution. Many of the employers had catastrophic fires of their oil rigs, and the refining operations were sabotaged. Nobel always got off pretty easy because his employees always liked him.
So much so that you reveal in the book that they actually aided him in his escape from Russia at the risk of their own lives. As the National Review reinforces, in contrast to previous generations of Nobels, including the aforementioned patriarchs, who only had to deal with the Tsars, that here Emmanuel must contend also with a couple of young bloodlusty partisan gnats, Vladimir Ulyanov and Joseph Gushnovili, while at the same time Lenin and Stalin will eventually seize the Nobel's life work. As this nationalization of the family's oil empire was taking place, please talk about how Emmanuel self-exiled to Stockholm and he set out to outmaneuver political power and his rival oilmen one more time.
When it was time to get out of there, a number of his employees helped him to escape. They designed this escape route, by covered wagon and trains and dog sleds and disguises, and he was helped to sort of, stay out of Stalin's clutches.
Turning back to the present, where are you heading next in history on the page?
I am sort of looking around for the next thing, but it's I'm kicking around a couple ideas in the same time period, the quarter century leading to World War I. It's a great hinge point in history. The world started living in a totally different way. All these empires crumbled: the Ottoman Empire, German Empire, Russian Empire, Austrian Empire, all blow up as a matter of World War I. And this feudal empire way of living changes. More people moved to cities. So it's just a big hinge in history, and I think it's an interesting period of time to examine. So the next book probably be somewhere in there.
In another forum, what have you most enjoyed about sharing conversation and cocktails with some of your favorite authors on your dedicated podcast?
I don't think I could leave anyone out. They're all great. They're all fun. I'll tell you, there have been some favorite cocktails. Jennifer Egan with the Gold Rush was really good. They tell me what their favorite cocktail is, and then I make it on the set. It's a nice change of pace too, to get out and be able to talk to some people. As a writer, that's fairly isolating. So the
Solitary.
show, yeah, it really is. And so the show's a nice way to get out and meet some people and talk about the craft of writing too. And there are common things. I mean, it's all storytelling. Whether you're writing fiction or speeches or nonfiction or songs, it's storytelling. After that, though, it's all different. Everyone has a totally different way of doing it. Some people are very detailed outliners. Some people just sort of outline a bit. Some people refuse to outline. They want to, have no idea what's coming on the next page, no more than the reader will. And so it's interesting to see people all come at it in different ways and how differently each person's brain works in telling the story. I mean, my own favorite cocktail is a rye Manhattan, and so Douglas Murray had that, which was good. I was have my own favorite cocktail doing my show, so that was fun.
Finally, what advice do you have for a fiction author trying to transition into writing narrative historical nonfiction?
Read, number one, and write, number two. I mean, it sounds so simple, but it really is the toughest advice to follow. And I'll give you one story on that, actually. Diana Gabaldon, the author of Outlander, which is a terrific show and terrific books by her. So she's on the set of the show, and the actors are there, and she's gotten to know them all, and the show's a huge hit. And the actors would come over, a number of them would come over to her and say, ask what you asked. Like, what's the advice you have? Like, I want to write, and I love your books, and how can I do it? And she'd say, all right, well, let's start with this. For the next 10 days, spend at least 20 minutes writing, whatever you want. It could be a letter, journal entry, the beginnings of a short story, the beginnings of a novel, whatever you want. But for 20 minutes every day, for 10 days, write, come back, and we'll talk. They all say, okay. And guess what? No one ever came back. No one could write for 20 minutes, 10 days straight. It's just like, so that's, if you can do it, you're way ahead of the game. Read a lot and actually do some writing.
Doug, it's been fascinating talking today. Thanks so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much.